You take a child abuse case where maybe a child's been neglected. You have a relationship where, there's supposed to be trust, and then there's vulnerability, and that child being neglected results in that abuse and trauma. And it's the same way with our spiritual and religious communities. This is supposed to be a relationship of trust. You're my guide, my shepherd, my teacher, my mentor. If there are vulnerabilities, and these vulnerabilities get wrapped up in things like self-worth or my connection to God, and so I'm very vulnerable in letting somebody guide me through those things. I mean, that's what we're all trying to make peace with how the world works, and so it's a very vulnerable place to be.
Welcome to the Colleague Down the Hall podcast. This episode is sponsored by the Collab Oasis Clinical Consultation Groups. Hi, I'm Janine Wolf, and I'm your colleague down the hall. I have a passion for helping fellow therapists get the clinical and collegial support we all need to do this work. And wow, it just keeps getting harder every day. I'm the founder and facilitator of the Collab Oasis Clinical Consultation Groups. I have been a social worker for almost 30 years, and I own a successful solo online private practice. More of us than ever are practicing in solo or online practices, and we all need colleagues to process cases with, commiserate with on those really hard days, and also to celebrate our successes with. In this podcast, I'll bring you insights about trends and changes in our field and sit down with amazing therapists who are doing amazing work. We'll discuss fictionalized cases, ways to practice sustainably, and of course, there will be plenty of laughing. I love laughing with friends. I'm so glad to have you as one of my colleagues down the hall. Hello, everyone. You are listening to another episode of the Colleague Down the Hall podcast. I'm your host, Janine Wolf, and I'm joined today by Chris Conley. Chris is an LPC in Virginia, and the focus of his work is on religious and spiritual abuse. So that's what we're going to talk about today. Welcome, Chris.
Hi, Janine. Thanks for having me. I'm excited to talk to you today.
Yeah, absolutely. Me too. And I'll just give you a little plug. He and I saw each other in real life recently at the Clinician Connection conference that he and Lisa Dews hosted in Virginia Beach, and it was amazing. And
I'm so glad you came. It was a fun time.
Yeah, absolutely. So if that's something you're planning to host again, I would encourage people to come. It was nice. I live in Virginia Beach, so I think it's beautiful here anyway. But it was just such a nice group of people, and it was really nice kind of hanging out, but hearing you had great presenters as well.
Well, thank you. Yeah, we're working on getting next year's date locked in, and probably within a week or two, we'll be sharing that information out. Just gotta get things straight with the hotel and the calendars.
Sure. Yeah. Okay. Do you have a place people can sign up on a wait list that we can put in the show notes if they're interested in learning more?
Yeah. Just if you go to clinicianconnection.net, you can keep up with things there. And there's a button to sign up for email updates.
Okay. Awesome. Well, I would encourage all the listeners who are even considering wanting to do some training. They did it in the spring this past year, but you can get on that wait list and find out more information. So let's start off with talking about, let's define religious and spiritual abuse, because I think most of us haven't learned about that in grad school. I think it's kind of an up-and-coming treatment area. I think it's probably been around for a long, long time, that type of abuse. But as far as it being an area of treatment, and I could be wrong, maybe there have been people treating this for a long time, but let's talk about what it is.
Yeah, so religious and spiritual abuse is one of those things that, the category of abuse in general is so broad, you know, and so this turns into a very niche version of abuse. And so I think the helpful way to think about it is it's characterized by religious or spiritual elements being present, and it is usually when an individual or a system or a group of individuals who hold some sort of religious authority or they're higher up in a hierarchy, because most churches and mainstream religions have hierarchies, whether it's just your pastor and his parishioners. But when that person who has a high level in the hierarchy takes advantage of or manipulates those underneath to meet whatever ends they're trying to accomplish. And one of the things I like to highlight in that discussion too is those of us who work in mental health recognize that we also work in a power differential. Like we are the counselor, the therapist. And so we have a kind of a authority, not authority like we're the boss, but we have a role as the authority in the room where we're supposed to be the trusted one, the safe one. And it's a very similar dynamic in religious spiritual abuse as you have a person or a group of people or a community that's supposed to be a trusted source that is now hurting or manipulating folks.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And so with that said, because I think most therapists understand the power differential, clients aren't typically aware, maybe on a, subconscious level, but they're not thinking like, well, sometimes they are. I actually have clients that will ask a question like, am I allowed to do this? And I'm like, yes, of course. Like, you can do anything you want. Let's talk that through. So
Right.
we do have clients that recognize that on some level. But I think it's an important thing because I would imagine that if a client comes in and they're trying to talk about this religious or spiritual abuse and the therapist shuts them down because they don't understand, that could be very, very harmful.
Yeah. Well, and another good way to look at what you would classify spiritual or religious abuse, it's actually one of the first texts that was really discussing it came from a couple of pastors, and it's called The Subtle Power of Spiritual Abuse. And their definition was spiritual abuse takes place when an individual goes to a spiritual leader or guide for empowerment and walks away disempowered. That's a much more simplified definition than the ramble I just gave you.
Right. Yeah. And I think about the church that I grew up in, and the pastor was excellent, but he was so inaccessible. Like, he stood up there and preached about the way we should be living our lives. And so, as a elementary, middle school kid, I'm thinking like, oh, he's got it all pat. Like, he gets it. He knows all the things, and I can never be that person. And then later in adulthood, we had a pastor who would literally in the middle of a sermon say, I'm really struggling with having the right word, so can we just pray for a minute? And he was vulnerable, and that made such a difference. And so I would imagine that that's an element of someone that is able to inflict that type of abuse, that they have this all-powerful perfection type of image.
Yeah, there's a lot. There's actually another book called When Narcissism Comes to Church by Chuck DeGroat. And it is about how a lot of that abusive behavior takes place because of the ego or the narcissism of the leader or the system, So as somebody, so I have a history of working in churches. In my first career was actually ordained minister, and I could actually still do your wedding if you want. I always tell people I'm technically ordained to do weddings. Yeah. But, so I've been on both sides, where I've been somebody who's attended a church, I've been somebody who's worked in a church. And there are so many good pastors, priests, clergy throughout every walk of faith that we have. Yeah. But those are the things I think that we will notice is when a religious leader really suffers with sometimes the pressure of having to be a perfect representative, and that can spin into the bad behavior, or they're just very narcissistic and ego driven. And, I often say, you compare what happens in spiritual abuse to what happens in any other kind of relationship abuse. If you have a relationship where we're supposed to be trusted, safe, protected, something has gone wrong, because that relationship is typically also has a layer of vulnerability. Something has gone wrong where harm is. So you take maybe a marriage where there is some domestic challenges going on. Initially, you have a relationship that's supposed to be safe, but now vulnerability is being taken advantage of and it's not safe. You take a child abuse case where maybe a child's been neglected. You have a relationship where, there's supposed to be trust, and then there's vulnerability, and that child being neglected results in that abuse and trauma. And it's the same way with our spiritual and religious communities. This is supposed to be a relationship of trust. You're my guide, my shepherd, my teacher, my mentor. If there are vulnerabilities, and these vulnerabilities get wrapped up in things like self-worth or my connection to God, and so I'm very vulnerable in letting somebody guide me through those things. I mean, that's what we're all trying to make peace with how the world works. And so it's a very vulnerable place to be, and that's manipulated and harm happens. And that's not to even, we need to mention as well that in the process of that, some of those other types of abuse get put in too. Like there is physical abuse that takes place, sexual abuse that takes place, neglect that takes place with that spiritual lens on top.
Right. Yeah. So then we're talking about, like so many of the things that we work with in our field, there's a spectrum. There's mild situations where it's maybe even unintentional on the part of the religious leader. And then we have an extreme, which was, I had never been exposed to this type of thinking before. I mean, obviously we have some of the polygamous communities where there's lots of that type of abuse. It was the Shiny Happy People special on Netflix, the specific denomination that the Duggar family from however many kids and counting. My daughters were followers of that for a while. And when I watched that, it was shocking. And they had adult women talking about their experience as young women, children, teens, being married off to these people or given to these people sexually. So you do have those extremes.
Yeah. And like you said, it is an extreme, just like, we use other types of abuse. When you have a married couple and one of the spouses just loses their temper once because they had a bad day, we're not labeling them an abuser for having a bad day, right?
Right.
So you can have spiritual leaders who have bad days or maybe have some struggles with their own personality traits. That doesn't make them an abuser. Abuse lies in the consistency. Abuse lies in the intensity of the behavior, and abuse lies in the intention behind the behavior too, right? So, it's consistent, it's intentional, it's intense. Every pastor, priest, spiritual leader, you're allowed to have a bad day. You're allowed to make a mistake. You're allowed to give bad guidance here or there. Like, that's not abuse. Abuse is when you're doing this intentionally or consistently.
Right. Yeah. And that just goes back to something I talk about very commonly about the therapist experience, is that we are humans who are also therapists. So we have humans who are also pastors or religious leaders in some form.
Absolutely.
Husbands who, humans who happen to be husbands or wives. We all have those vulnerabilities. But so the intention seems like it's more of where things sort of take a turn.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And like the Chuck DeGroat book I mentioned earlier, When Narcissism Comes to Church, does a really great. It is very Christian focused, and religious and spiritual abuse goes beyond Christianity. It's really easy for us in Western America to talk about it through a Christian lens, but his book really talks about like the traits that make a narcissistic spiritual leader, and talks about what church communities and systems can do to like work through and heal after those experiences. It's probably my top read on the topic for somebody who's interested in just jumping in. But yeah, it's you're right. It is hard because we're all just normal people.
Right.
All just normal people. I mean, even, your honest everyday pastor is just a guy who's trying to do what he thinks is right for the people in his community, the things that he thinks is right to honor God in the process. We all make mistakes along the way, no matter what our own faith is or what our own worldview or values are.
Right. Yeah. And also, I suspect that lots of fields where there's a power differential, there can be that unsuspecting seduction that occurs where you have this interaction with somebody and you sort of get this kind of like dopamine hit, or, it's like that feels kind of good, and you unintentionally start replicating that behavior. So, as humans, we are going to do that kind of stuff. And in our field, we stress over and over ethics and making sure you're touching base with colleagues, making sure you're talking through things with people that might be able to say, hey, it sounds like you're going down a path that's not such a great idea.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Of course, there's a lot of seductive, a great word for it. In our field, one of the top, if not the top things that people lose their licenses over are inappropriate relationships with clients, i.e. sexual relationships with clients. And, every time I talk to residents or interns or supervisees about that, they're like, I just don't get it. I'm like, you don't get it? Let's talk about it for a second. Right. You as the therapist are somebody who is feeling very needed in that moment if you're not careful to mind your own feelings. Mm-hmm. Meanwhile, your client is somebody who has potentially struggled to feel connected and is feeling connected. So you take somebody who struggled with connection or relationships, they have a connection with a therapist who gets them. That therapist starts to feel really needed and important. It's only a matter of time before those lines can blur if we're not careful. And that is the exact same dynamic that can happen in a religious or spiritual relationship. Take an individual that's maybe had a hard time understanding how the world works, or they have worldview questions, and oh my gosh, this is the pastor that finally got through to me, and he's like nice to me, and he's kind, and his teaching makes sense, and I'm feeling connected to God. And now that pastor may feel good to be needed. This person's feeling connected to him and this community in a way that they've never felt connected before. Not hard for those lines to get blurred. And because again, we're all normal people with those struggles and those needs to feel loved and connected, feel a place in our world. So yeah, seductive is a great word to use to talk about that tension. I call it, I have called it a pastoral codependency in the past.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Making, finding my value only in what others can get from me. That's a very hard struggle in the pastoral world. And I have buddies who are pastors, and they'll talk about it. And they're like, I worked really hard to preach a message this week, and like nobody seemed to care about my message. Or, I did 3 funerals this week, and like nobody seems to care. And so they have that desire to be needed, connected, but they also have that hierarchy relationship, and which just makes them vulnerable for trouble.
Yeah. Okay. And so I'm also thinking about a number of cases I've had where people attended a church. It was preached that you always tithe 10% no matter what. So I've had clients that couldn't buy groceries, couldn't pay bills. They were not allowed to ask the church for support because the church didn't provide financial support to anyone, but they were expected to always tithe. And there's a struggle because I'm like, but you can't pay your bills, but at the end of the day, this is powerful, this message. They're going at least once a week, hearing this person who's filling their cup in lots of different ways, and they sort of lose sight of the big picture.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's one of the things that's hard too, is when you're working with these folks, you really have to be okay with checking your biases at the door. I mean, we know that in general as counselors and therapists, we check our biases, but just because it's a practice that you don't think is healthy or good for the person doesn't mean it's abusive. And you may have, me personally, like, because I do still attend church, I still do consider myself a Christian. I know how to read through the Bible, study, etc. I might be able to sit with somebody and say, there's a different way to interpret some of those passages. But like, that's not my role as a counselor to go in there and do like that theological or spiritual work. And so sometimes when you have somebody coming in and they're dealing with a stressor and they say, I have to do this because it's what my faith teaches, then our job is to help them kind of adjust to the reality of that decision. So somebody says, hey, I can't pay my bills because I'm supposed to tithe. That's what God wants me to do. And I'm convinced that that's what I'm supposed to do. Then it is okay. If that is your conviction and that is the value you hold to your life, that you tithe to your faith community, then what does it look like to struggle with groceries? How are we going to work through that part? Even though look at you and me might look at it like, girl, stop tithing. Dude, stop giving that money right now. You can't afford it. But if that's their value system that helps them make sense of God and the world, we got to be careful not to chip away at that. It's I've worked with an individual in the past who she was going through marital stuff, really wanted to get a divorce, but her faith says you don't get divorced. And so we talked about like the couples counseling route. Well, I don't think he'll go for that. And I was like, then I guess our job is to work on making peace with the situation you're in.
Right.
Because if divorce is not an option, if couples counseling is not an option, then it is, how do I accept and make peace with this marriage I'm in? And again, it would be very easy for me to say, girl, get out of that relationship, or like, hey, you need to like demand couples counseling. What?
Right. Yeah.
That's where it gets hard, and we have to really be mindful of our own biases and opinions. And, that's when you go get a beer with your colleague and you're like, oh my gosh, this girl, she would just divorce her husband. She'd be,
Yeah, that falls into the category that I think about as, you're sitting with a client, you sort of test the waters a little bit a couple times. You realize this is a really firm boundary for them. So then you just get used to having yourself screaming in your head, oh, what are you thinking? And you're doing your work, you're staying neutral, you're supporting them exactly like you said. But that doesn't mean it's easy. And I just kind of want to name that as the thing to normalize, because we don't discuss that a lot in our field. But sometimes we're working with cases where we just, see someone suffering and we want to help them in the suffering or get into a better place, and they're not ready or willing to go there. And we have to accept that. And that takes a toll on us.
Yeah. And I think in the spiritual and religious area, we have to be doubly mindful of our biases, because most people, I think the last statistic I read is in America, some 97% or 93% of people identify with some sort of religion or spirituality, not necessarily one of the Western religions, but some sort of religious, spiritual path or worldview. And most of us, if we do, have some pretty strong feelings about that, or it's very meaningful for us. Like my Christian faith is very meaningful to me. So I have to be mindful of that, because I have to guard against that in the therapy room. We know how to be neutral. We do it all the time. Especially, I think of any of our colleagues who work with teenagers and they come in and they talk about the newest dude or girl they're dating. And we already know this person's bad news for you, bro. You need to move on. But we don't do that. We sit, we listen, we hear, pending we hear anything that's of crisis level abuse, disturbance, we just sit with them and yeah, man, it's hard when your girl never answers your text, or it's hard when your dude says such hateful things about your family, or, whatever, so we know how to do that. We have that skill set. I think, again, the challenge with the spiritual and religious stuff is we all, majority of us anyways, have really strong feelings about faith, religion, spirituality.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah. Yeah. And so that sort of leads me into thinking about Christian counselors. And so that seems like if someone's seeking out a Christian counselor, what are their expectations and what maybe their guidelines for this? And you don't know, or I don't know. But so how do you have someone who's a Christian counselor bring in that unbiased opinion at times without bringing in their own Christianity, their own religious views?
Yeah. So it's hard, right? Because the faith piece can be a great rapport builder, and it can be a great unifier in the therapy relationship, right? I mean, we see this in other contexts. Somebody says, I want a therapist who looks like me, or I want a therapist who has a gender identity the same as me. Why? Because then I will feel some connection, or I'll feel a level of this person gets me in a way another therapist, even another good therapist, might not get me, right?
Right.
You're not audience to my life and my experience the same way. So the same thing is true here. A lot of folks, they might say, hey, I'm a Christian, so I'd really like a therapist who matches my worldview. Where we get into the muddiness is, are you asking me for spiritual and theological guidance in the process? Mm-hmm. Or do you just feel more comfortable because when I talk to you about tithing, you'll probably know what I'm talking about? Or if I say, hey, we have Sunday school, you'll probably know what I'm talking about. If it's for that connection piece, that's no problem. If it's that spiritual guidance, if it's that theological thing, or, I want to incorporate the Bible into our sessions, I don't know where the lines should be drawn for everybody. I know where my lines are drawn, and my lines are drawn in that I'll engage in spiritual practices with you if we're using them for coping skills, right? Mm-hmm. So you want to pray in session? We can pray in session if it's one of your coping skills. I'm not going to teach you how to pray or give you spiritual feedback on your prayer, but I'm going to allow you to facilitate that because it's a coping skill. You want to discuss what you've been reading in the Bible, or you want to share a passage in the Bible with me, I can have a discussion with you on that, and how it's impacting your day-to-day or the things we've been working through. I'm not going to interpret it for you or try to teach it to you, or give you Bible lessons. That would be the line I would say for most folks who are Christians in counseling, and they have that kind of, I'm a Christian and I want a Christian counselor connection. Where I would deviate from that a little bit is actually in my case, because I am an ordained pastor. I do have the skill set. If it's established in this therapeutic relationship and it's asked, hey, this is what I'm looking for, then we review that in informed consent through conversation. I'm open to a little bit more of that, but I still want to keep the focus clinical. And I say that I'm open to that, but I really don't do that very much. Like, I'm open to it if it comes up, but it's out of, for most of us as counselors, even those of us who would say, yeah, I'm a good Christian, I go to church, I know my stuff, whatever, it's out of our scope of practice. We are clinicians, so we focus on mental health, relationships, behavioral health. If the person's primary concern is spiritual guidance, then we refer them to their, church or their pastor, or we help them connect with one if they don't have one. I mean, even yesterday I was in a session, and a client I've had for years, and, just sharing and processing some stuff they were going through. And, they just asked, I just don't understand why God lets all this happen to me. I don't understand why God lets all this happen to me. And I was real quick to say, like, I don't either. And I'm not the person to even help you find that answer.
Right. Yeah. What a great way to address that, because we know that clients come to us for answers. That's not what we do. So it's our job to help them gain insight and explore their experiences and feelings about things and guide them towards resources. So what a great, succinct way to sort of guide them back to understanding that that's not our role.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So one of the things I'm finding as I talk to so many people with different specialties in this field for the podcast is that I always come back to, how can therapists assess for this? And the more I'm asking this question, the more I'm thinking, like, okay, we can't assess for everything like at the beginning, right? But we need to have a skill set to understand how to look for areas that maybe we need to assess. And typically I'm thinking assess to refer out, although people in community mental health may not have that option. They may need to continue to work with a client. But if someone is suspecting this, what would you suggest they do as an initial way to assess further?
Yeah, well, I mentioned earlier that the latest statistic I read said 93% of folks have some sort of religious, spiritual affiliation. Yeah. So I think right from the intake process, and I think most of us do this, but asking, is there any spiritual or religious aspect of your life that's meaningful or important? And then is that something you want to talk about or not? There's probably more eloquent ways to phrase those statements and questions.
Sure. Yeah.
But, from the intake processing, and you can even ask, has your faith, spiritual system, whatever, has it been helpful or hurtful? Mm-hmm. Those are good intake questions. If somebody says that they're open to talk about that, those are a couple good intake questions. There's a tool out there called the Spiritual Abuse Harm Scale, or the Spiritual Harm and Abuse Scale. I can never remember the name of it without looking it up. But the author of it is Koch, Koch. It was released in 2022. And it's, our typical kind of 2-page screener where you have a list of experiences and you rank 1 to 5, how it happened to you. And it can really help gauge if somebody's had experiences that could indicate some religious or spiritual abuse taking place. And so that's a good start. I think the tricky thing here is, well, I guess this is not unique to spiritual abuse per se. An individual may have experienced it and not recognized it as abusive.
Right.
Like you think about your person you mentioned earlier saying, oh man, I got tithed, but I can't buy groceries. They're not necessarily saying, oh my gosh, my church is abusing me. They're just saying, oh, I'm going through this struggle. Same way that we've had clients come in and we're like, oh, your spouse is not, this isn't cool, but they don't see it that way. But yeah, I would start with some simple intake questions, again, assessing, like, do you affiliate with any religious or spiritual tradition? Are you active in that religious or spiritual tradition? Is that something you want to talk about in therapy? Has it been helpful or hurtful for you? That's enough there to get that conversation going if it's part of what they're dealing with. And then tools like the Spiritual Abuse and Harm Scale are great.
And that makes me think back on my early days in the field. I worked in pediatric hospice, and that was one of the intake questions we asked. And as a grad student, I was so uncomfortable with that. I was a Christian, but I also know how polarizing spirituality and religion can be in this country. But once I sort of learned to shift it to like, I'm looking for strengths here. I'm looking for things that they navigated and what were the supports that helped him navigate that successfully so we can pull in those strengths. And so I think for me, reframing it because to me, I just felt like I was being nosy at first as a young grad student. But when I kind of reframed it as, no, I'm asking them about lots of different areas of things they've experienced and what were the things that were hard to navigate and what were the things they navigated well. And can we kind of suss out like what helped them?
Yeah. I mean, that's interesting, right? Because if you feel like if I ask them about their faith or religion, I'm being super personal and intrusive.
Right.
But most of us, maybe it won't fall for some of our practice, but most of us have no problem with like, how is your sex life? How is, so we could have the hard conversations or the awkward conversations. I just think with knowing that almost everybody holds some spiritual identity, and what that spiritual identity does for us, it's just crucial to make that part of the process, unless a person specifically doesn't want to.
Right.
Because that spiritual identity, and I mean, literally, our spiritual identity, our worldview, it's how we make sense of the world we live in. Mm-hmm. That of the utmost relevance to working through any of our mental health or relationship issues.
Right. Yeah. And so in the case of somebody so they recognize that maybe the person has really specific concerns in this regard. This is not their area of expertise. I'm one that will say you can either seek consultation with someone who knows this and see if you feel comfortable and they feel comfortable with you working with this client, or you need to refer out. And then for those people in agency work where they can't refer out, then seeking out some of the resources that you've shared. Those people typically don't have a budget to pay for consultation from somebody, but there are resources out there to be able to learn more so that if nothing else, they're not creating harm. Maybe they're not going to help with a lot of the type of work you do, but they're not going to make the situation worse.
Yeah. And, yes, it's wise to seek consultation, trainings, all that. But the other thing to keep in mind is you can still help somebody with some of what they're experiencing. Unless somebody's direct desire and primary goal for seeking help is, I want to make peace with my spiritual abuse, or I want to mend my relationship with my faith, you can still have somebody who says, I'm in this weird thing with my church or my pastor and I have anxiety. I can still help you cope with anxiety, even if I'm not an expert on spiritual abuse and trauma. If I am, and if I have experience in trauma treatment, I can still do trauma treatment for you without necessarily understanding that 100%. But yes, if I ever feel out of my, league or out of my scope, refer out, get consultation 100%.
Yeah. Okay. All right. And then lastly, are there counselor identities that people should be mindful of, or the client identities that might impact this work?
There's nothing specifically that comes to mind, as long as you can check yourself as a therapist. Like we were saying earlier, if we have a spiritual or religious faith, we probably feel strong about it. And so we just have to make sure that doesn't influence. And if it does, if we have a hard time with that, like this isn't me, but if I was a Christian therapist and I'm very strong about my faith, and so somebody came in and maybe they're an agnostic or an atheist and they're like, F the church, this happened and this happened. If I don't feel like I can hold that because, oh my gosh, you're talking poorly about my faith, then yeah, I do need to refer out immediately. I cannot work with that person. And there may be clients who ask those questions and make a decision based on that. That hasn't happened much in my experience. But, they might say, hey, like, I don't want a Christian therapist who's a Christian because I think Christians are all wackos who believe this wacky book. And if that's a boundary they have or need, then that obviously should be honored and respected. But I don't have one that, I would say black and white, you always have to avoid. I know there can be some tension in the LGBTQ community and the more conservative religious community. I don't know that that's a deal breaker in therapy, but it could be. could be.
Okay. Yeah. And I'm so appreciative of that example that you just shared, because I've been doing more and more trainings for therapists around referring out. And so often in therapist communities, you see people saying, well, you're just being lazy. You're referring that person out. And they are subscribing to that old blank slate ideal that we just have to show up and we can't be human and have our own needs. And as our world continues to get more complicated and polarized, there are times that we need to say, every time I see this client, they rant and rave about something that's part of my identity and it's wearing me out and I just can't do it anymore. And so, yes, I can refer that person out for my needs. So I'm glad you shared that example, because it's not something we discuss enough, I don't believe.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's important. I probably fall in the middle of that discussion, because there are definitely times I'm like, no, you can still see this person. Like,
right.
You need to check yourself. You need to grow, or you need to,
Yeah. Oh, 100%. Yes. You don't just jump immediately to referring out, but if it's taken a huge toll on you personally.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. So anyway, that's a conversation that I think we're having more of. And again, I suggest that people get consultation. That's always my go-to, consultation. If you're thinking you can't work with this client, then you need to talk to some colleagues. Right. You need to talk through it with them and decide, maybe you're bumping up against a growth place where you need to get more support in consultation and education, and you can work with this person, and that's going to make you an even better therapist. Or you're right. I see you coming here. Every time I talk to you, you just look exhausted. You're really struggling to see the rest of your caseload. And then that becomes more of an extreme.
Yeah, absolutely. Yep.
All right. So I want to always ask everybody if you have a favorite catchphrase or an analogy that you like to use with your clients.
Yeah, so I'm gonna use a metaphor for you, and I think this fits particularly with the religious and spiritual work. And so I had a conversation with a colleague a few years ago who is a very open member of the LGBTQ community. This person, knows that I'm a Christian and that I've been a pastor in the past. We are great friends, but we know that there have been places where maybe not us as individuals, but our communities have butted heads. And then this person would ask me questions about, like, oh my gosh, I just don't understand why some people just can't, in this day and age, see that LGBTQ folks are just normal folks, and all that. And so what I told her was that, one, she's correct that we need to have that attitude towards everybody. But what's hard in the spiritual religious realm, and this would transcend to any point of abuse like we've been talking about, it. It's like that sweater with a loose thread. And once you pull at that thread, the whole sweater risks becoming unraveled. So when you have somebody who was born and raised in a church and told that being homosexual was a sin and a problem, in 2024, that's not a view that a majority of people hold. And even folks who were raised to believe that, a lot of them wrestle with, can I really believe that? But the minute they pull that thread, it's not just flipping on one belief, it's challenging a whole belief system, right? So if my pastor growing up told me that being homosexual is a sin and he's wrong, well, was he also wrong when he told me Jesus forgave my sins? Was he also wrong when he told me that there's a heaven? And so, no, I think I'm just going to double down and stay in my corner and believe what I've always believed. Right. So anytime any part of your spiritual or worldview is being challenged, for an outsider, it might be like, I just don't understand why you don't see this pastor is abusive, or this church isn't good for you, or they want your tithe, but you don't have groceries. Well, if I pull away at that part of my worldview, I risk unraveling the whole thing, because the pastor that says I have to tithe every week is also the pastor who preached my grandma's funeral and told me I'm going to see her in heaven one day.
Yeah.
And so that is the work of that spiritual existential exploration, is recognizing it's delicate. And so, I've said it probably 100 times in this conversation, why it's so important to check your biases. Because I am an ally of the LGBTQ community, 100%. I still have to be really delicate when I have conversations with people who aren't there yet. And right. not because I'm trying not to stand up for what I believe in, but because I know I'm pulling at the sweater.
Yeah, that's That's such an important point that, again, you're setting aside your personal beliefs. You're coming to the conversation and supporting them with where they're at and recognizing the bigger picture. Yeah, that's such a great point. Thank you. Well, I really have enjoyed talking to you today, Chris. Thank you so much for taking the time to join me.
Yeah, it's been great. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're going to put in the show notes information about where they can contact you. And I'll put in the clinician connection information as well. Is there any other places? Do you have any social media or any places like that you want people to look, like if they want to follow you, get more information?
Yeah, just my name on Facebook and Instagram is fine.
Okay. All right. Perfect. We'll make sure we put those in the show notes then. Okay. So please remember, for all those out there listening, that our work is hard, but it doesn't have to be lonely.
Thank you so much for listening to the Colleague Down the Hall podcast. For show notes, links, and downloads, head over to colleaguedownthehall.com, where you'll be able to learn more about getting the clinical support you need and resources to help you work in a supported, sustainable way. If you've enjoyed this episode, please share with your therapy friends and colleagues. Subscribe to the podcast, and if you love this episode, please leave a review.